Hi, everyone, and welcome to AXA Arctic Live. It's great to have you all part of this live lesson, which is looking at carbon emissions and the Arctic. We are joined today by Dr. Helen Findlay from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Good morning, Helen.
Good morning, everybody.
How are you?
Yeah, doing all right, thank you. Feeling nice and toasty in my jacket.
Perfect. Well, it's looking a bit chilly down in the southwest. But before we get to the body of the lesson, in terms of our Q&A about the impact of carbon emissions on the Arctic, we're just going to let you know where we would be if we were on Arctic Live. Now, Arctic Live is a long-term education program and also marine monitoring program, and we are based out of the UK's Arctic Research Station, and that's run by the British Antarctic Survey, and that is in a small settlement called Ny-Ålesund, which you can see behind me. Now, Ny-Ålesund is on the island of Svalbard, and Svalbard is an island, an archipelago group of islands, halfway between the top of Norway and the North Pole. I've just got my mini globe here, just to show you where that is. So we come in here. This is Svalbard, the North Pole, top of my mini globe. Got Norway here, UK, France, Spain, Greenland, and then North America over to the side there. Now, Ny-Ålesund used to be a mining settlement. It was set up as a coal mining settlement, but over the past 50 years has changed to be a base for scientific exploration of the Arctic. And it's not only the UK who have a research station up there, but many other countries as well. Of course, Norway, and then we have France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, India, China, and other stations up here as well. It's a really international feeling in Ny-Ålesund because you also have a host of other nationalities who come up to do research. Now, Arctic Live, as I mentioned before, part of it is a marine monitoring program. And that means we're looking at how the ocean, the sea, is changing, or maybe not changing. But we're looking at the human impacts on the ocean. We're looking at two. We've done a lot about microplastics in the waters behind me, well, in front of me, in fact. The fjord is that way. And today we're looking at something called ocean acidification and why that might be a problem for marine life. And basically, what is it? And that's going to be the focus of our talk with Dr. Helen Findlay. I'd love to show you what Ny-Ålesund is like right now. And I know that our producer, Ellie, has hooked in to the webcam. The webcam is based up in the Zeppelin Observatory. That's this little black dot on the ridge behind me. And perhaps we can see what kind of weather we would be enjoying if we're up in the frozen north at the moment. Ellie, take us away.
Absolutely. Well, today, from that camera behind Jamie, if we transition to that, and this is the view down the mountain, and if I play the last 24 hours, this was updated 12 minutes ago, so it's the latest weather view. You can see quite a bit of fog yesterday with some ice coming through in that fjord, and then as the sun sets, well, not sets, but as the sun crosses the sky, we get a bit more blue water again in the fjord. So very cold today. It's about -6 at the moment up there, and as you can see, 24 hours of daylight, so the sun just circling across the mountains at the top, at the back there. So fresh, crisp, very cold out on the water, I'd imagine, today.
Brilliant, Ellie. Thank you very much. It's a nice -6, not too cold, but certainly not towards the slush of sort of -1, +1 that you can experience in late spring in Ny-Ålesund. Now, the format of this live lesson, we're going to have an introduction to ocean acidification by Helen. Then we're going to come to some of the pre-submitted questions that you've been brilliant and sent in. And then last, we're going to come to the live chat. Now, the live chat to the side of the video is using YouTube, and that's a social media platform. So if you are under the age of 13, please make sure you're logging in with a parent, teacher, or guardian, and they're helping you post any comments, shout outs, or questions. Please also make sure that we treat this like a live lesson rather than a live chat room. So please keep your posts on topic. That would be absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to see who we're being joined by today. We've got some great shout outs, and we've got some great people and comments coming through on the live chat. I can see Greenhill, Goodmaze, Lamerton, all on the live chat just on the screen here. But I've got a shout out to Isla and Kadi doing online geography learning with GeoVLE online Geo School. So good morning to both of you. We've got a big hi to Greenfalls High School's higher environmental science class in Scotland who are watching with Ms. Morrow. So good morning to everybody watching from Greenfalls. We have good morning from everyone at Goodmaze Primary School. So everyone at Goodmaze, hi, wonderful to have you with us. We have class 2 from Lamerton Primary School. Hello. We have Oscar, and Oscar, apparently it's your birthday on the 22nd of May, so that's next week, 5 days after Norway National Day, so we'll have to find some good Arctic Norwegian way of celebrating. You're going to be 11, and it's a long message because Oscar's one of our longest standing fans who apparently absolutely loves the live lessons and will miss all of them. And it's been fantastic having you with us, Oscar. So wishing you a very happy birthday for a few days' time.
Happy birthday, Oscar.
Happy birthday.
We've got Kites class at Roxton Primary School. Good morning to everybody at Kites class. We've got Alex from Cransley. Good morning, Alex. And from Collerton Grammar School in Devon, we have the Year 8 geographers tuning in from home during school shutdown, and that is with your teacher, Ms. Hickey. So good morning, everybody from Collerton. Helen, we have carbon emissions and the Arctic. We've covered a lot of different topics during Arctic Live, AXA Arctic Live over the past 2 weeks, and we've heard about carbon sort of driving changes, including warming, and that leading to sort of loss of sea ice, loss of sort of ice sheets, and that kind of thing. We're going to be talking about ocean acidification today. We've got lots of questions on carbon emissions, on the levels, how we can reduce these. And obviously, many of our viewers have picked up quite a lot of knowledge from the news, from the media. We're going to come on to that in a bit. But before we get into that, there's part of this increased carbon emissions sort of issue that is ocean acidification. And it's not as well known. What is ocean acidification, Helen?
Okay, so ocean acidification is what we call the other CO2 problem. So we've all heard about CO2 going into the atmosphere and causing these global warming issues and other changes. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the oceans actually naturally take up a lot of this carbon dioxide. And they do that as a natural process. And normally over long periods of time, geological time, that carbon dioxide is taken up and it changes the seawater system, but it's buffered. So we've got things in the ocean that can absorb that carbon and it doesn't really matter to the ocean. The problem we have at the moment is that the rate of CO2 addition, the rate of adding that carbon dioxide is so fast that these geological processes aren't able to keep up. So if you add carbon dioxide to water, it actually reacts with water and it forms a weak acid called carbonic acid. And I think we should be able to see an image there of these reactions. And so that carbonic acid then actually breaks down to form hydrogen ions and something called bicarbonate ions. And those hydrogen ions are what we're interested in because they actually relate to acidity. So if you have more hydrogen ions, the seawater becomes more acidic. So as we add more carbon dioxide into the water, we make the seawater more acidic. And so it's really that rate of change that we're going through at the moment since the pre-industrial revolution that's really the the impact that's causing this ocean acidification that's of concern to us.
Helen, and you mentioned making the seawater more acidic, and for those watching, you may have come across sort of the idea of acid in your science classes already, and we measure this using something called pH. If briefly we can sort of go over that sort of idea of sort of acid, alkaline, and pH, Helen, just to get that sort of that science piece sort of covered.
Yeah, of course. So when we talk about pH scale, it's a scale that just measures the amount of acid in a solution. And you should be able to see on screen now a representation of that pH scale, which goes from 0, which is the most acidic, up to 14, which is the most basic or alkali. And just like a temperature scale goes from minus 20, or up to however much, 100, in the middle of that you have 0, and the temperature of 0 is what we call where normal water freezes, and that's the freezing point. But it's not where everything freezes, it just happens to be where water freezes. So the pH scale is just like that. We have a scale from 0 to 14, and what we consider 7 is where plain water has the same amount of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, which are the other ions that make up water. And so it's in balance for pure water at 7. Seawater is actually a little bit more alkali, a little bit more basic. It's got less hydrogen ions in it than pure water does. And so it's around about 8.1, 8.2 on the pH scale. And so what we're talking about when we're talking about acidification is we're actually moving down towards the acidification at the acid end of that scale. So we're moving from 8 towards the 7 level. We probably won't ever reach 7 in most locations around the oceans, but we are adding more acid, so we call it ocean acidification.
Helen, thank you very much. That's definitely cleared things up for me, and I hope that's made the idea of pH easier to understand, or recapped some of that knowledge for those of you watching. Helen, you mentioned before this relationship between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in the ocean, so the dissolved carbon dioxide, and then this pH changing, and how those are all related, and how that rate of change is happening quite fast at the moment. And I think you have a graph that you can show us to demonstrate, or to show that relationship.
Yeah, so what we can actually measure these CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and we know that most people probably understand that. They probably hear about the Hawaiian time series, the Mauna Loa time series, and we measure CO2 concentration in the atmosphere all around the world in these monitoring stations, much like weather stations are all around the world. But we can also measure seawater CO2 concentrations. And so on this graph that you should be able to see, you've got the red line is the atmospheric CO2, the dark blue line, which is a bit more wavy because we have a bigger seasonal cycle in the oceans. That's the seawater CO2. And you can see that's going up at the same rate as the emissions in the atmosphere. And then the light blue line is the seawater pH. And that just shows that as you are increasing the seawater CO2, you're seeing this decrease in the pH as well.
So Helen, we've got this change in ocean chemistry. We've seen from that graph that an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide leads to an increase in ocean carbon dioxide, and that leads to an increase in acidity, i.e. a decrease in pH. Why does all this matter?
Well, it matters for many of the marine organisms that live in the oceans. So if we think about they've evolved over long periods of time, we haven't had a big change in pH like this, as quickly as this, for at least 600,000 years. And that's a long time for many of these organisms that have quite short generation times and can evolve quite rapidly. So they've become used to this stable conditions in the oceans. And humans, just like humans, we have to keep our blood pH at a certain level. And if we change that, we could become quite ill. So if you think about organisms in the ocean, many of them also have to maintain their internal pH or their internal functions at a certain level. And if we change that, then they could become ill as well. They could become impacted. So some organisms are able to they're better able to cope with those changes. They've got mechanisms inside them that are able to buffer those changes in pH, but other organisms are actually, their internal pH and their body functions actually follow the seawater pH really closely. And so if we change the seawater pH, we see a direct change in some of their internal pH conditions and their internal functions. The other thing we're really worried about is organisms that produce or have calcium carbonate structures. So shells, corals, so things like mussels, oysters, clams, crabs, corals, all those kind of creatures have what we call a calcium carbonate shell. And as the waters become more acidic, it actually becomes corrosive to those shells. And so anything with those kind of materials, those shells or skeletons, actually needs to expend more energy to produce those shells if the water becomes corrosive to them. So they have to mend them, they have to build more of it, and that takes up energy. And so that can have a real impact on them as well. So we're concerned about two things. That the big one really is these shells, because that's going to be a very direct impact. But then secondary to that is these kind of other body functions that are going on that rely on a stable pH level.
Helen, thank you so much. And I believe a lot of the focus of your work and a lot of the focus of the animals that we study on Arctic Live are not the sort of iconic Arctic species like the polar bear, but in fact smaller types of animal. I mean, one of my favorites is definitely the sea angel or the pteropod. And how are these small creatures, I think we've got some images of them, how are these small creatures sort of being affected, and why does studying small creatures matter?
Yeah, so I'm interested really in the bottom of the food web, the food chain. So things like the phytoplankton and zooplankton. So things like these pteropods. Also, you may have watched yesterday and heard Kerry talking about copepods, or throughout the rest of this week, you probably had copepods a few times. Copepods and pteropods, they're secondary, they're consumers. So they eat the phytoplankton, they eat the plants of the ocean, and they're really important food sources for many other animals in the ocean. And pteropods are really interesting because they're one of the main prey for most of the species in the Arctic. So at some point within the food chain, something will have eaten a pteropod in the Arctic and also the Southern Ocean as well. They're interesting because you've got two different kinds, really. You've got these pteropods which are kind of more like sea angels. And I think later on we'll maybe have a video of that. So if you've got the pictures up on screen at the moment, then down in the bottom right-hand side, there's a reddy looking, it's got red, left-hand side, sorry. Down on the bottom left is one that's kind of red. That's not really got as much shelled material on it, but the ones above that, they've all got, they're called sea butterflies because they look more like butterflies and they've got these shells as well. So you can also, they look a bit like sea snails, but they float around in the plankton. And so they're really interesting to study because they've got these shells as well.
And Helen, you mentioned before that ocean acidification can affect the shells, or that these animals might need to expend more energy. Do we know, without a time machine, what will happen to these shells if the acidity of the ocean continues to increase?
Well, yeah, the interesting thing about the Arctic is that actually acidification is already a big impact for many of these species. So we're already seeing levels of corrosive waters appearing seasonally, so some time of the year, usually in the wintertime, in the Arctic Ocean in certain places. And we can go out and measure the amount of impact that's happening on these pteropod shells. And I think we've got an image from the Beaufort Sea, which is an area above the Canadian Alaskan Arctic, which shows some of these shells in high resolution. They're very tiny, so it's a microscopic image, and you should be able to see that there's little pits in them. You can see damaged areas of them, and some are much more impacted than others, but that's where you're starting to see the corrosive water eating away at these shells. And so that's already happening in areas of the Arctic today.
Helen, brilliant. I think we're just going to sort of move this on, and what fascinates me, and we first met in the Arctic about 10 years ago, is the sort of the passion to gather data at very, very low temperatures. I know you've sort of lost sensation, or you've got a dead end of your finger, for instance. That level of commitment to get data. And I'd love just to share with the audience, before we get to the question part, what it takes to gather some of this data. And I think you've got a short video showing just some of the life in the waters around Ny-Ålesund. And then we can go into some of the field work, the expedition work that you've been doing.
Yeah, that would be great. So I think the videos was taken in 2009. Hopefully it's playing now. And it just shows some divers that were collecting samples for us. We were running ocean acidification experiments on pteropods, and also the crabs that you see, the spider crabs, which should be coming up on the video. And so we sent divers. The fjord at that time of year was actually completely frozen, and they had to cut a hole into the sea ice to actually let the divers go in and collect our samples for us. So you should be able to see some pteropods swimming, and then the divers will probably be getting out the water, and that's how we have to collect the samples for animal experiments, and we bring them back to the lab and then conduct our experiments on them.
Helen, and I think just to show that this is a very serious job up in the Arctic, but certainly compared to the boys on the expedition, you took your sort of hygiene a bit more seriously than we did. And I think that if we're going to see, one of the things I love about being on that expedition, it is hard work, but there is a lot of fun side at the moment. I remember when you decided to wash your hair at about -40, and something wonderful happened, which I think we'll see in a moment. But what I'm seeing coming over on the live chat is a lot of questions asking. Basically, people want your job. Okay, so if I think if you tell us a little bit about washing hair at -40, and then we'll get into the job and the career piece of a field scientist, a polar scientist.
Sure. So this was in 2010 and 2011. We were up in the Canadian Arctic doing some sea ice work. I was up there for 2 months. And so, Jamie, you said I was maybe more hygienic, but I was there for 2 months. I think I had a wash or a shower twice for that whole time. So this is one of the times I washed my hair. It was -40 outside, and things dry, sort of freeze dry when you're at that cold. So basically, you can make your hair stand on end. So if you wash your hair, just be prepared for it to go very cold and hard for a while, and then it dries through ablation, which is great fun. Makes some great photos.
Brilliant, thank you, Helen. And I mean, a lot of the time that we were up in the Arctic, you were sort of like stuck with a sort of water sampling bottle in a sampling tent, bring out water. We've got that sort of photograph to show, but what advice would you give to those watching, probably age from sort of the upper primary school all the way into secondary school, for those who want to follow in your footsteps?
It's not all about fieldwork, would be my first message. We do spend a lot of time just sat at a computer, like many other people. So there's lots of writing, there's lots of reading, So yes, stick to science, and if you're interested in science, stick to your science subjects and do as well as you can at those. But also you do need to be quite good at maths, and reading and writing is really important, just as much as any of the other subjects. And just be investigative, ask questions about everything. I think my biggest push was that somebody told me I couldn't do something, and so I kind of went out to try and prove them wrong. I was 11 when I decided I wanted to be a marine scientist. I didn't really know what that meant, but at the time it sounded quite cool. And one of my teachers, I can't remember who, but they said that it was too competitive and I'd never make it. So here you are. You never know. Just keep on. If you want to do something, just keep on going for it. I'd also say it is competitive, but you can do little things to help yourself out. So anything additional to school, make it your passion. If you're interested and your passion comes across when someone's interviewing you or talking about the job or whatever it is you want to do, that passion will come across. And that's as important as the knowledge, because you will learn how to be a researcher, but you'll never learn how to be passionate. You have to have that come across from you. So do the little extra things that you enjoy doing. Go out and look for bugs, or go out to the seaside. Try and join in with extracurricular activities if they're available to you. Do the online classes if they're available, and just really enjoy it. Enjoy your passion.
Helen, thank you so much. Stay curious, be passionate, work hard at science, maths, and everything else as well.
Yeah.
It seems that it does offer. It's not all field work, but certainly there are those sort of highlights throughout the career. Helen, we've got a good whack of questions to get through. So we'll start off with, if possible, sort of short answers, and then we can always elaborate later on. The first one is from Rafa, who's at Colleton School in East Devon, who wants to know how much carbon dioxide is dissolved in the ocean.
I can't give you an exact number, but about 30% of what we emit into the atmosphere goes into the ocean.
Brilliant. So about 30% there. From Nate at Colleton, we were looking at those pictures of pteropods and with the pitted shells, but will marine life be able to adapt to rising carbon dioxide levels in the ocean?
It's a great question, and one that we're still asking as scientists. So there's still a lot of investigation going on into that, so I can't give you a definite answer. But we believe that there are a lot of organisms that have these quite short life cycles that should be able to adapt. And what we're trying to do with climate change as well as ocean acidification is find out species that are more tolerant to these changes and try and help them to build up a kind of a tougher set of creatures that will be able to function in the marine ecosystem and actually provide that level of adaptation that is needed to survive. So hopefully, yes, there will be winners, there will be losers, and so it will be a changed world, I think.
Thank you, Helen. Where you mentioned this before, but this is a question coming through from an online learning platform, GOVLE. You mentioned that the Arctic Ocean is acidifying faster than other places. And the question is there more CO2 in the Arctic Ocean than other oceans? And just to follow up, so why might that be the case?
So the short answer is no, there isn't really more CO2 in the Arctic Ocean than other oceans. The problem with the Arctic Ocean is that it has a lot of freshwater influence. And so these processes that kind of can absorb CO2 and buffer the change in pH actually are diluted. So if you think you're adding this fresh water, it actually kind of adds more acidity anyway. So it's already it's kind of already susceptible to being acidified, and then we're adding more CO2 on top of that as well. Cold water does take up more, it holds more carbon dioxide, but the way the oceans work, they also transport carbon dioxide out of the Arctic at a similar rate. So it's kind of, in terms of CO2 itself, it's not much different, but it's not able to what we call buffer these changes in acidity, and so it's acidifying much more rapidly.
And is that freshwater input coming from the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, from the sort of permafrost sort of areas and sort of the Mackenzie rivers and the sort of Ob in Siberia, all just increasing that freshwater input into the Arctic Ocean? If you imagine the Arctic Ocean, it is it's like a sort of it's a sort of ocean surrounded by land, so it must be sort of all that increasing fresh water coming in.
Yeah, the Arctic Ocean is one of the smaller oceans, but it's the one with the most river input of all our oceans, and it's a combination of all of those things. So the changing sea ice, so the loss and the melting of sea ice, that's changing the freshwater balance. Adding the river runoff, that we've seen a much bigger discharge of rivers running off into the Arctic over the last few years, and that's had a huge impact, especially over in the Siberian seas, so the Russian side of the Arctic. They have had really huge levels of river influence, and also seeing a lot less sea ice than they would normally. And so kind of you've got that combination of freshwater, open ocean, so the sea ice also kind of acts as a barrier to carbon dioxide sometimes. And so when you remove that sea ice, you actually can get more CO2 added in as well. And so the Siberian side of the Arctic is one that is of particular concern.
Thank you, Helen. We in climate science and also sort of general looking at environmental change, you mentioned the figure, of the rate of change of acidification being faster than, definitely sort of any time since sort of for the past sort of 600,000 years. There's a question coming through again from GeoVLE, which is, what is the most reliable way of measuring past climate change? How do we know?
Well, we use proxies, what we call proxies. So a lot of the data has come from ice cores. So we can go back a certain period of time using ice cores. I'm not a paleoscientist, so I couldn't give you the exact details, but you should be able to see an image of going back through time. And we can use these ice cores to measure the gas concentration in the bubbles of the ice. And that gives us a pretty accurate representation of what the atmospheric CO2 levels were. And then for sort of pH and in the ocean, we actually use proxies of things like these levels of calcium carbonate minerals in the sediment. So we can take sediment cores from the bottom of the ocean, and we can see what kind of sediment was there. If there was lots of sort of brown sludgy stuff with not much chalk in it, then we can suggest that the oceans were much higher. They had a higher level they had less acidity, and if they've got more levels of chalk, they've got less acidity, and if they've got less levels of chalk, then they're probably more acidic. And you can see these abrupt changes through time without having figures in front of me. It's easy to get confused. So even experts like me get confused talking about it sometimes. So it is a tricky subject, but there's a lot of reliable ways to get those data using those proxies, much like we would look into paleontology for looking at dinosaurs or human history. We can date things quite well with the instrumentation available now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Helen. Question, this is from Joseph at Colleton, wondering whether there's been a significant decrease in carbon emissions due to coronavirus. Obviously, in the news, there have been several articles written about nature rebounding because of the reduced human pressure. Are we seeing that with carbon emissions as well?
So we have seen a very small drop in carbon emissions due to COVID. And I think you should be able to see a figure now, which is the Mauna Loa, the Hawaiian observations of CO2, showing the long-term trend and then also this seasonal cycle. And basically what we've done is reduced the seasonal cycle a tiny bit. And one of the reasons for that, there's kind of a couple of reasons. One of them is that when we emit CO2, it takes a long time to kind of circulate through the atmosphere and actually be reduced, be taken up by all these sinks, the trees, the ocean. So it doesn't happen instantly. So anything that we do now isn't necessarily, it's going to have a longevity of it. It's going to be in the system for a while. The other thing is that COVID has shut down a lot of things, but there's still a lot of emissions going on. We've reduced a lot of personal air travel, but things like the shipping, the transport of foods, goods still has to get to the supermarkets. So people are doing a lot less individually, which is great. And that's the kind of thing that we're seeing. But industries are still active. We've still got coal-powered stations running. We've still got energy generation going on. And so there's still all these kind of other industries which are still emitting, and they haven't shut down because we need them. And so that's maybe why we haven't seen as much the drop as perhaps people expected to see.
Helen, we talk about some of the reduction, or the sort of a small reduction here. I think a lot of people are also during the lockdown reflecting on human impact on the natural world. Now, there's a sort of group of questions that are coming through about what can be done to reduce emissions and to keep warming sort of down towards a target. I'm sure you've got an idea of what that target could or should be. But what is the role that individuals, as of governments and or corporations could be playing? I mean, we can take those sort of one by one.
So on an individual level, I think we're all on the right track. Lockdown is a pain. Don't get me wrong, it's not the ideal situation. There's many things that we need to do, but I think you're right. It has given us time to think about the way we do things. Certainly as a scientist perspective, we travel a lot for conferences and for meetings, and we need to do that. But we also need to now think about whether we should be doing that in the way that we have been doing it. And so for me as an individual, it certainly made me consider how much we can travel, how much I should be traveling, and how much we can use these virtual meetings and virtual webinars and things like that. And I think it's really shown that we can do a lot online. And so I am hoping personally to reduce my flights, maybe just do one big travel a year and that would be it. I know a lot of people don't even do that, which means that they're not using planes, but reducing air travel is a big one. Switching over to electrifying your houses and your cars, that will come into force. Eventually the governments will put in place that we need to switch over to those, but the sooner we can do it, the better. So if there's ways that we can produce our own energy, if you can get solar panels, I know as young people, perhaps you can't, but talking to your parents about it or discussing it with them might be a way to really kind of think about how we can move forward as individuals. There's obviously a cost to that. I understand that as well. And so really this is where it comes back to the government needs to put in place incentives and really give people the opportunity to do those individual changes and make those individual changes happen. We don't want to have to pay a lot of money for doing these things, but in the long run, the cost, if we do it now, will be much less than the cost we will have to pay if we keep having floods, or if we keep having extreme weather conditions, or if we have people moving about because they've lost their homes because of these changes. So at an individual level, we really need to be thinking about how we get our energy and how we use our energy. An industrial level as well, that's where we need to be moving as well. We need to be thinking about switching over to renewable sources. We need to be thinking about better ways of transporting goods. Eating less meat, I know it's a controversial subject, but eating less meat actually does have a big impact. How we farm, we should still be farming, we should still have agriculture, but there are ways that are better to do it and less impactful than some of the big agricultural farming industry practices that we have today. And like I said, governments really need to be pushing all this through by giving us incentives and giving industry incentives and also making it mandatory in some cases that we need to switch over to electrified systems as well. So I think my partner works in the utilities industry. They've just released that there's a new cycle scheme coming out. So there is government money there to put in place bigger projects for things like making it easier to walk and to cycle around cities and things. So that it's coming, but it just needs to be perhaps a bit quicker than it has been.
Helen, thank you so much, and a great explanation of the role that we can all play in reducing carbon emissions and our impact on the planet. There are a lot of questions coming through on the live chat, and we may not get to all of them. So what we're going to do is that Helen, we're back on at 5 o'clock this afternoon, UK time. We will take all of the questions that have been posted in the past 5 minutes and up to the end of the session, and we'll make sure that we get to all of them in this afternoon's session. If you haven't subscribed to the Encounter EDU YouTube channel, do that and you'll be notified when that comes online, and that will be available for catch-up viewing as well. Helen, there's a number of questions both coming up on the live chat and submitted in advance about your sort of work as a scientist working in the Arctic. And the one that I think is great from Greenfalls High is has your perspective on anything changed as a result of the work that you do?
That's a great question. It's a difficult one to answer. Yeah, I guess it has. I'm a lot more aware of the impact that I have as an individual. I have 2 small children, and I guess when I first started out as a scientist, I didn't have them, and I didn't have quite as much knowledge about the changes and impacts that we're having. And certainly with the Arctic, I remember saying to someone maybe 8 years ago, if I ever have children, I'd like them to learn about sea ice in science lessons and geography lessons and not history lessons. And the further along the line we go, the more I feel like that's not necessarily going to happen. So my perspective is certainly changed in terms of wanting to do more. I work more now with policy as well, so I'm kind of switching over a little bit from actually doing the science to trying to get policy to change. So I think that's something that we need to do because we need to be getting on with this change.
And thank you so much. And just to end, you've given us sort of direction, a steer towards curiosity, all these things. What's the highlight of your job? What's the highlight of going to these amazing places?
There's probably 2. The polar regions for me, particularly the Arctic, there's just something about them that they're as pristine as we'll ever experience. There's no or very limited contact with any kind of the what we call normal outside world. You're in this beautiful place. The environment is just incredible, and there's some kind of addiction to it that I have that it's very difficult to explain. The light is amazing. There's different dynamics, the beauty of just seeing all this pure white everywhere around you. But then also, I think the other thing for me is the people that you go on these trips with. You're with a very select few people for quite a long period of time in some cases, and you really get to know them as family, and it's the people that really make the trip as good as it can be. So finding out this new knowledge and learning about these new places is amazing, and I'm very privileged to be able to do that. But sharing those experiences with a very select few people is also something that you can't really get in many other cases. So those are my highlights.
Helen, thank you so much for sharing it. Beyond those people who you go on these expeditions with, to all of those amazing students, teachers, parents, and guardians who have been taking part in this live lesson. You've got so many great questions, and we really want to answer them. Very sadly, that's all we have time for at the moment. but we'll be taking those questions, making sure we get to them during our afternoon session, and that's at 5 o'clock. But for now, it's goodbye from AXA Arctic Live. Goodbye.